Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
The clock ticks down to President Trump's now delayed trade deadline.
The administration, the president, and his trade team want to cut the best deals for the American people and the American worker. That's what they're focused on.
Following his big, beautiful bill win and a U.S. stock market hitting a record high last week, the president is now delaying that self-imposed trade deadline to August, issuing the first in a series of tariff letters to trade partners like Japan and South Korea. The deal's in the works and the new August 1st deadline when former U.S. Trade Rep Carla Hill joins us.
Plus, tragedy strikes in Texas with more than 90 killed in catastrophic flooding over the weekend.
In the wake of every tragedy, there are things that are predictable. One of the things that's predictable is that you see some people engaging in, I think, partisan games. This is not a time for partisan finger-pointing and attacks.
Parts of the state still reeling and the search and rescue effort ongoing, with more torrential weather on the way as FEMA sends resources in. We'll have more on the response and questions around the agency's role in future disasters when we speak with former FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell.
And the America Party sends Tesla stock tumbling.
If he cannot be Tesla's full-time CEO, the board needs to take that into account and needs to hold him accountable.
Investors weigh in on Elon Musk's promise to create a new political party in real time. Where the stock landed today at the close and what it foretells for Musk's political aspirations, all coming up.
But we begin our coverage with the president fresh off a big legislative victory, now pushing ahead to a bigger task on a global scale, imposing new higher tariffs on international partners. The White House today announcing that long-promised July 9th trade deadline has been delayed to August 1st, with the president posting letters addressed to the leaders of at least 14 countries detailing the tariffs they could be hit with on that date. 25% for Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, and Tunisia, 30% for South Africa and Bosnia, 32% for Indonesia, 35% for Serbia and Bangladesh, 36% for Thailand and Cambodia, while Laos and Myanmar will be hit with 40% rates if no deals are reached by next month.
The news making markets dip midday before that deadline date change from the White House. We have the news covered from all the angles for you tonight with Bloomberg Economics' Jennifer Welch covering the White House from here in Washington, Romaine Bostick following the markets from our world headquarters in New York. We start now with Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics. Jennifer, it's great to have you with us here at the table. Markets are trying to figure out what matters here, what's real. Should we be paying more attention to these letters that went out today or the deadline that has now been punted to August?
I think the biggest news of the day is the deadline being extended to August 1st. Many of these letters just cement in place the reciprocal rates that were announced on April 2nd. There have been some discounts for some countries, but many of them relatively marginal. So it's not going to make a huge dent. And now there's 3 additional weeks to negotiate deals to avoid even those higher rates.
Well, it also becomes a question of how these countries are going to respond to this threat, knowing the president in each and every letter said if you impose higher tariffs as a result of this, we're going to layer that rate on top of the rate outlined here in this letter.
Absolutely. And I think many of them are just going to continue their existing MO, which is to continue talking to the United States. That's been working so far in terms of avoiding higher rates. It's not clear the logic that was used to apply discounted rates for some of the partners. It's also not clear why these 14 countries are the ones that received letters today and whether there will be additional letters in the coming days and weeks. But at the moment, I think most countries are going to kind of wait and see and continue to try and talk to D.C.
Do we have any reason to believe this is working? Now that we've seen the deadline moved a couple of times, just the threat of reciprocal tariffs. Donald Trump says everyone's calling the White House and that they want to get a piece of the action here. Is that true?
It is true that there are talks underway with a number of key trade partners. I think it is also true that those talks have proved more challenging and longer than the White House might have hoped that they would be. Back on April, when we delayed these tariffs for 90 days and they were claiming that they were going to reach basically a trade deal a day, obviously that hasn't borne out. We've only got 2, UK and Vietnam. Some of the trade partners they were expecting to have a deal with first, like Japan, aren't close to sealing a deal, at least at the moment. So I think what this points to is the fact that those negotiations are still very tough, especially when you have the lingering issue of sectoral tariffs that are going to weigh on conversations with Japan, with the EU, et cetera, that are not just worried about the country-by-country tariffs, but those key sectors that they trade with the United States heavily in.
Well, and to your point on countries we thought we were close with, who could have a deal announced in the next couple of days? Because initially we were told by the Commerce Secretary last week it was going to be 10 before July 9th. President Trump said it wasn't just letters we were going to get today outlining tariff rates. We were going to get the announcement of deals, too, and those have not yet materialized.
Very uncertain environment. I will say, and I caveat this as what the White House is saying, which, as you noted, we've been here before. We've heard this before. But some of the deals that they've talked about as being closer are, for example, with Indonesia, which just received a letter. Taiwan is another key one. India and Pakistan. The EU says that it is also trying to lock in a preliminary deal this week that would sort of secure that 10% holding rate past August 1st to allow time for negotiating a permanent deal.
Just to put a finer point on this before you leave us, when we talk about trade deals with the UK and Vietnam, are we talking about framework deals? Because there are still a lot of details, especially when it comes to Vietnam, that we just haven't heard yet.
Absolutely. And even with the UK, there's still elements, including around steel and sectoral tariffs, that are still being worked out. So, yes, I would frame these more as frameworks rather than full multi-chapter trade deals.
All right, Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, thank you so much. Now, the president's trade letters today spooking equity markets, which closed lower by nearly 1% across the major benchmarks, having just ended last week at record highs. More stocks more than fully recovered since the initial Liberation Day nosedive. And joining us now with the details from World Headquarters in New York is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. So, Romaine, even though there could be argument for there being evidence of taco today, it doesn't look like the taco trade was necessarily in action.
No, not at all. And in fact, you mentioned those letters coming out. I believe the first couple of the ones for Japan and South Korea became public right around noon Wall Street time. You saw an immediate drop in equities here in the United States. In fact, the S&P dropping almost a full percentage point. And we saw the more economically sensitive sectors of this market, particularly the Russell 2000, drop even further than that. But Kayleigh, I want to borrow a phrase from one of our Bloomberg editors, Sean Donnan, who was on the close a little bit earlier. And he talked about this idea that this really is not anymore a discussion, a negotiation about trade. This is a negotiation about tariffs, and that is what appeared to spook this market a little bit. When you think about the record run that we had heading in to this week, there was this idea that trade deals, that some sort of a resolution to all of these tariffs would be in the works, maybe not immediately on July 9th, but certainly over time. And I think the letters we got, even with that August 1st extension, is now giving investors maybe a little bit more agita about this idea that no matter what deals are struck, the tariffs that will be in place will be significantly higher than where they were when Trump first came into office, and that was not necessarily priced into this market.
Yeah, that's not taco, Romaine. That sounds like a market that's taking this president a little more seriously in this case. Then again, could traders have been looking for an excuse coming off all-time highs here? We are still looking at a VIX below 18. You could have seen a much more severe reaction today to this idea of 25% tariffs and then some on some of our partners.
Yeah, it's possible some of this could be profit-taking, but I also want to turn your attention to something Trump said a little bit earlier about the BRICs. This is a block of emerging market countries. It includes China and Brazil and India and a few others. They're actually having a meeting right this week where they did address very publicly their concerns about their trading relationship with the United States. And Trump, of course, taking to social media saying, hey, don't strike any deals amongst yourselves that would undermine your relationship with the U.S. And you saw some pretty big sell-offs in the commodity space, particularly when it comes to industrial metals like copper. Of course, Brazil, a huge producer of copper, aluminum, a huge drop in corn as well. So there's a lot of concerns here that this goes well beyond the idea of just profit-taking in equity markets, that there are fundamental shifts right now taking place, Joe, that have not been resolved and, more importantly, have not been priced in by financial markets.
Well, when we consider what financial markets have priced in, Romaine, where is optimism, if any, around the big, beautiful bill that the president just got to sign into law on the 4th of July? The idea that taxes aren't going up. In some ways, tax cuts are being expanded from what we saw in 2017. Is that not enough of an offset?
Well, that's the funny thing. I mean, we talk about, Kelly, the idea that a lot of the good news in this market had been priced in, including the potential upside from that big, beautiful bill. And now the concern is that you have a market that was positioned for the best case scenarios going forward. And now they wake up today and have to realize that maybe, at least on the trade and tariff front, maybe some of the worst case scenarios now have to come back into this market. And I believe that is now the yin and yang that we're going to have to see play out over the next few few days, at least until July 9th and maybe now, I guess, to August 1st, the idea here as to whether whatever upside was in some of the other policies, Kayleigh, ends up being X'd out by some of the tariff and trade policies.
So we had the Trump trade following the election, Romaine, big rally. Then we had the taco trade. We've retraced this remarkable decline, coming back to all-time highs here. What's the story in the second half? What are analysts thinking? Do we all have to chase dividend and value here? How do you get out of this?
I mean, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to people on Wall Street, meaning the institutional investors, they'll tell you, yeah, you want to remain defensive for the rest of the year. Defensive types of stocks, a higher weighting into fixed income and other areas of the market that would be protective. But I believe we had this conversation a while ago on your show about the record rally that, quite frankly, Joe, was driven by retail investors that aren't as shook about some of these tariff and trade issues. So they are still piling into crypto companies like Circle and Coinbase. They're still piling in to high valuation stocks like Palantir, like CrowdStrike, stocks that have basically led this rally and that a lot of retail investors think are going to lead this rally going forward. And part of that is because they're making a bet that those companies might actually be insulated from some of the worst aspects of the trade and tariff debate, and maybe they will carry this market going forward.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us from New York this evening. Thank you so much. And now we want to take a look at some of the other stories that we're following in today's Bloomberg Power Brief. President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discussed replacing the current Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. during a phone call on Friday. The current envoy, Oksana Makarova, was appointed in February 2021 and has stayed on after her term officially expired. The potential personnel change comes as President Trump's efforts to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine have stalled, and a week after the U.S. halted the transfer of artillery rounds and air defense to Ukraine.
TikTok is reportedly building a new version of its app for its 170 million U.S. users ahead of a potential sale. That's according to a report from The Information. It says the new version is set to debut in September. The Information reporting users will have to re-download the new version and that the current app will stop working in March. Last month, President Trump again extended the deadline for TikTok's parent company to divest its U.S. assets. On Friday, he said a deal was near, but any agreement would have to be approved by Beijing.
And Apple is appealing a $580 million fine from the EU that it calls unprecedented, calling regulators' demands unlawful. In April, the European Commission fined Apple for violating policies that would allow app developers to steer users outside of Apple's own app store to make purchases. Apple since changed its EU App Store policies to meet local requirements and avoid additional penalties. Apple is facing similar regulation in the U.S. after a ruling from a California judge earlier this year. Coming up, Elon Musk announces his plans to create a new political party. We'll bring you the details and the hit that Tesla took today. But first, 3 days after cataclysmic floods tore through a stretch of Texas Hill Country, officials are continuing search and rescue efforts as the death toll rises. We'll discuss that and what a potential future without FEMA could look like when Deanne Criswell, former FEMA Administrator, joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I need to tell my community and those families who are waiting, this will be a rough week. Primary search continues, and we remain hopeful every foot, every mile, every bend of the river.
That was Kerrville, Texas Mayor Joe Herring Jr. earlier today, speaking to the rescue operations that are still underway after a weekend of catastrophic flooding across the region in Texas. At least 90 people were killed and many are still missing after torrential rain fell into the Guadalupe River, which surged 26 feet in less than an hour. Today, thunderstorms are forecast through west central Texas, hindering rescue efforts and renewing concerns over even more flooding. And joining us now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio on the response to the tragedy is Deanne Criswell, former FEMA Administrator during the Biden administration. Deanne, thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power as we consider the weather still being a factor here and that this is still an active rescue and recovery effort. Can you just shed some light as to how much of a complicating factor that is for an area of Texas that has already suffered so much tragedy in such a short amount of time?
Haley, the onset of additional weather just makes it so much more difficult for everybody, for the first responders, but also for the families who have already been displaced. You know, they want to go out there and help their neighbors and try to find some of their belongings or help to try to find the missing loved ones. But if this weather continues to come in, what you may see is people, you know, end up in a compromising situation, and it puts their own safety at risk again. And I think, as you heard from the press conference earlier today, you know, really encouraging people to stay out of harm's way. But they've been displaced from their homes, too. And so they have to make sure that they are in a safe place, that they're in a spot that's going to keep them and their families safe from this next round of weather while they continue the critical work of searching for those that are still missing.
Well, and indeed, I'm glad you mentioned that as these search and rescue efforts continue, Deanne. We'd like to hear from you on the challenges facing FEMA. Obviously, this is a large-scale disaster that we're talking about here, and we know that the administration has different ideas about the way FEMA should be conducting its business. Just 4 days into this term, President Trump went to North Carolina. You probably remember to tour damage from Hurricane Helene, which you know a lot about, and had this to say about FEMA. Listen.
I'll also be signing an executive order to begin the process of fundamentally reforming and overhauling FEMA, or maybe getting rid of FEMA. I think, frankly, FEMA is not good. I think when you have a problem like this, I think you want to go and, whether it's a Democrat or Republican governor, you want to use your state to fix it and not waste time.
FEMA's not good, he said. This should be the job of the states. Deanne, what lesson are we learning right now that the president might need to hear?
I think the most important thing is that it has always been the responsibility of states and locals to manage disasters. They are the first responders. They are the ones that went in to help those people that were impacted. The state sent in additional resources. They will be there long after the media leaves, and FEMA will stay to help them with the recovery. I think that there is an opportunity, absolutely, to improve the way we reimburse, or FEMA reimburses, the damages or the rebuilding that happens afterwards. That's something that should definitely be worked on. But when you look at a situation like Texas, and you look at the type of complicated search and rescue activities that have happened, or the amount of debris that's going to need to be removed, what FEMA does and what FEMA can do, and I think what often gets lost, is they coordinate the whole federal government. So if you needed to bring in the Army Corps of Engineers to help with debris removal, they coordinate that and they fund that through the Disaster Relief Fund. Or if you need to bring in hospital assessment teams to do the same thing. I think the first question should be, what problem are we trying to fix? There are some, without a doubt, but to have blanket statements without fully understanding what it is we're trying to improve just doesn't take into account the second and third order impacts that might come from that.
Well, and when we consider the capabilities of states who, understood, Deanne, are the first responders in any disaster scenario, Texas obviously is a larger one. Not all states enjoy the same resources. But is any state alone capable of responding to a disaster at this scale without FEMA currently? How do you prepare them for something like that if we are to see FEMA eventually dismantled, if that's still the president's aim?
I think the one thing that, Texas is capable of is they have resources, they have capacity. They are one of the most capable states that are out there. But you look at a situation that they're experiencing now, and they also need some assistance, right? And we shouldn't be asking state and local jurisdictions to replicate everything that the federal government can bring to assist them, because they just can't do it at the scale that the federal government can, right? The federal government can create those opportunities to be able to use across all of the states if they have need. But to have every state replicate that capability, I just don't think it's a smart use of taxpayer dollars at the state level or the local level.
What's the impact of the rhetoric? FEMA is not good, as the president said, and we all recall what took place in North Carolina. Deanne, I know you surely do, following Hurricane Helene, in which a lot of conspiracies needed to be debunked by FEMA and by representatives, including the fact that nobody can control the weather, the fact that FEMA is not there to confiscate your goods. We could see all of this replay in Texas. What are these agents at FEMA in for?
You know, that kind of misinformation does a number of different things, right? It creates an environment for FEMA responders to feel less valued, right? And they are some of the most dedicated public servants that I have ever worked with, who leave their homes and their families to go help those that have been impacted. And so when you start to impact their own morale, it can certainly impact how they're going to want to be able to continue to support. And we've already seen people take advantage of some of the buyout options that have been offered. But it also creates this environment with the local communities and their own reputation. I mean, I even remember in North Carolina, one community saying, this isn't who we are as a community. You know, we want FEMA here. We need you here. And so, again, it's important to get the right information out there to help people understand what's factual and what's not factual, because I fear that then people will not apply for assistance when it is available that they would be eligible for. We want to help them on that road to recovery.
Well, and of course, FEMA's role is really being active in that recovery. FEMA steps in when disaster has already occurred, Deanne. It becomes a question as well as to what can be done to better prepare any community from Texas to anywhere else in the country for disasters. We're seeing more and more severe weather events in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation. What do we need to be doing better in that arena?
I think it's important to be able to continue to not just look at historical events that are impacting communities, but to be able to use research and science to understand what the future impacts are going to be so they can make smart investments in mitigation to reduce the impact of these events. We have seen during my 4 years and already with this event that these types of weather events are breaking records, things that people didn't even expect or think was in the realm of possibility, how high these rivers are getting, or the number of tornadoes that are coming through a community, or how fast a hurricane is intensifying in the Gulf or the Atlantic. You know, these are continuing to break records month after month and year after year. So communities have to be able to think forward. They have to invest today to help mitigate against those and reduce that impact. And that's what is going to be the most critical as we go forward.
Deanne, you've been hearing, I'm sure, some of the reporting around what led to this, whether budget cuts had anything to do with it. Ted Cruz was asked about this at a briefing earlier, the senator from Texas, a briefing earlier today on the damage, and pushed back hard on the assertions that DOGE cuts impacted the Texas flood impact. Listen to what he said.
There have been some eager to point at the National Weather Service and say cuts there led to a lack of warning. I think that's contradicted by the facts. The National Weather Service here, New Braunfels is where they were headquartered. They had additional manpower. In fact, they had 3 additional people working that night, anticipating that it was going to be a very dangerous weather situation. I also think it's worth noting that the National Weather Service Union, which has been very critical of the DOGE cuts, has publicly said that they don't believe that the reduction in staffing had any impact whatsoever on their ability to warn of this event.
Deanne, we only have 30 seconds. You haven't seen any evidence that would lead you to believe this, would you?
No, I think the most important thing, as the senator mentioned, is to focus on continuing these search and rescue efforts. There is going to be plenty of time to look into what happened.
I appreciate the insights today. Deanne Criswell, former FEMA Administrator in the Biden administration. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Elon Musk is free to burn his own money in a political party. He is not free to bring shareholders like us along with him. He does not own Tesla. We do. And if Elon Musk does not want to be the full-time CEO of Tesla, he should tell us now.
That was James Fishback, former DOGE advisor, current CEO of Azoria on Bloomberg Tech earlier today. Fishback said that his company would delay the public listing of its Azoria Tesla Convexity ETF after Elon Musk announced that he would launch a new third political party over the weekend, the America Party. It's just part of the fallout coming from Musk's announcement. Tesla stock tumbling on the news today, closing down almost 7%. And joining us now live from San Francisco with details, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, the host of Bloomberg Tech. Ed, here we go again. Presumably shareholders are not happy across the board here, but what does Elon Musk actually have in mind? Do you suspect he follows through with this? How much would it cost? What would it mean for the company?
Yeah, I suspect he does, but Elon Musk is kind of the only consistent part of this, that what the pledge of the America Party is to fund specific House or Senate seats in where Musk believes that particularly GOP candidates or existing sitting members kind of went back on promises made prior to the November election. Musk's fixation is the debt pile and government spending. And he feels like that, and this is all catalyzed by the signing of the big, beautiful bill over the weekend, that when he was out on the campaign trail prior to November with the president, a lot of the emphasis was cutting government spending. And he's kind of stayed with this different point of view on fiscal policy from the president. And that's the battleground that he's picking. But James's soundbite just there are two kinds of camps. James is in the camp where he's like, just focus on Tesla. There are many Tesla, XAI, SpaceX shareholders that are like, just do your day job. The other camp is like how politically exposed he is now vis-a-vis his relationship with the president.
Well, to the point on doing your day job, Ed, it strikes me that shareholders can kick and scream all they want. They can sell the stock. But as long as Tesla's board still stands behind their man, it doesn't matter. Is that a correct way of reading things?
Yeah. The principal reason we had James on the show, he has very little exposure to Tesla, very small holding, and as Joe noted, they plan to launch this ETF. But he had written this open letter to the board. I wrote to the board this morning to ask them for comment. They never reply. They're not a very vocal board. But at the same time, like, it's always been the case that Elon Musk is stretched, right? He has always been at the helm of several companies at the same time. James Fishback is in the camp of people who are like, it's okay if he runs Tesla and also XAI and also SpaceX because they are analogous. There is overlap and they all work with each other. It's just not the same trying to run a political initiative. The counter-argument to that, of course, is Elon Musk was the biggest donor, basically, of all time prior to the November election. How is this any different? He's just using his net wealth to fund specific candidates. And then that takes you back to does he really want to be picking a fight with the sitting president of the United States right now when Tesla has so much regulatory exposure and SpaceX has so much regulatory exposure here in North America, in the United States, their most important markets?
Remember when he was going home, Ed? It seemed like he had learned some tough lessons after getting deeply involved in politics. It didn't take long to come back, did it?
No, it didn't take long to come back. But again, like, credit where credit's due, Elon Musk has been really consistent on this point. In that first week of June, where there was the tit for tat with the president on social media, and in the last 4 days or so, the administration has continued to emphasize the sort of Elon Musk displeasure at EV credits and incentives for clean energy industries. Musk hasn't really paid attention to that at all. It's just been the debt pile and this idea of U-turning on trying to cut down government spending. And he's at least been consistent in that point. But again, as Tesla's shares show today in their trading, that's not a good position. You know, investors vote with their feet, as the old cliche goes. And they basically are worried that this is not a good place for Elon Musk to be as the CEO of that publicly traded company.
All right, Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Tech, thank you so much. And Tesla investors may not like the announcement of this new party. President Trump also not a fan. He commented yesterday on Elon Musk's plan. Take a listen.
It's always been a two-party system, and I think starting a third party just adds to confusion. It really seems to have been developed for two parties. Third parties have never worked. So he can have fun with it, but I think it's ridiculous.
Joining us now with their reaction is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, the president described this as ridiculous. Third parties, he says, have never worked, and arguably the facts stand behind him on that. But can it work when you happen to be the wealthiest man on planet Earth?
Well, it's certainly money makes a difference in politics, but it isn't always the outcome, right? We've had lots of very wealthy individuals run for office, fund initiatives like this, and by and large, it doesn't go well. And so money on its own is not the issue. If he's going to go and try and recruit people to run in primaries against Republicans or Democrats who voted for this spending package, are they going to run as Democrats and Republicans, or are they going to run as America Party individuals? I mean, there's so many things that we don't know about this current initiative. But look, Trump is right about one thing. We're a two-party system. Usually the fights are within the party. Those are the fun ones. And they resolve themselves and we go forward. But the idea that just money is going to make a difference is, I'd bet against it.
Jeannie, you invoked Ross Perot earlier today. Your thoughts on whether this even gets out of the blocks? Elon Musk could learn a lot in starting a political party. And I wonder, who does it actually help? Democrats, possibly, by primarying these Republican candidates?
It could. And certainly Democrats are hoping that, he does something similar to what we've seen in the past. So something like a Ross Perot. We've seen third parties be able to eat away. He could also be in a position, if he did build this party in 2028 in particular, to cross-endorse a candidate. But that is a long way off. And number one, I'm hoping that Elon Musk is not making this decision based on an poll that he seems to have done, which said a lot of people want it. So I hope he is hiring some good pollsters to go out there and see if there is really a market for this thing. And then number two, you got to do the hard work of setting it up. And Donald Trump is absolutely right. That's the reason he didn't run on a third party as we look back to like 2012, 2016, because they seldom work. They're usually headed by an individual, whether it's Henry Ford or Ross Perot or Pat Buchanan, and they are successful as long as that person is heading it and able to run. Once they go away, the party goes away. And Elon Musk, of course, can't run for president. He can run for something else.
Well, that's true, having been born in South Africa. Rick, when we consider this notion that third parties never really be able to seem to gain a footing, though they can be a disruptive factor, we saw in 2024 the American electorate broadly hated their choices, at least when it was President Biden running against Donald Trump. They wanted another option. Is there political appetite for another option, even if you can't make it a political reality because of how entrenched the two-party system is?
Yeah, arguably the highest growth party in America is the Independent Party. Yeah. People tend to lose faith in elections if you're a Democrat or a Republican. And sure, there's always a level of dislike for a party's choice. But at the end of the day, most of those independents take a side, right? And they look at the candidates that are available on their ballot in their states, and they say, you know what, I'm going to go with this Republican or I'm going to go with that Democrat. And rarely does a independent candidate, and they're always on the ballot, garner anything that you would be considered substantial. In the point Jeannie makes, Ross Perot actually decided the outcome of an election. Yeah. So unintended consequences are usually what happens in this case.
Well, President Trump is feeling pretty good about himself and may not be too worried about a new political party after passage of the big, beautiful bill he has now signed into law, and had this message at the big ceremony on the 4th of July. Listen.
It's the biggest bill of its kind ever done by far. But we are going to have a situation, we are going to have something where people are going to realize the level of success and popularity of this bill.
All right, let's get into this with Rick and Jeannie here. Rick, he's seeing this as a huge victory. There were B-2 bombers flying over the White House on the 4th of July. He even got the First Lady to do the YMCA dance, which was pretty impressive. But now you could argue comes the hard part in selling this bill, actually the road show that's going to follow, making people feel good about it who are concerned about things like cuts to Medicaid. Can he do it?
Well, he's going to have to do it because in a vacuum, somebody is going to go out there and attack this bill. The Democrats are primed and ready for this. I have no doubt that they'll make their own initiatives to sell this as a real pullback of resources for the American people, a war on the middle class. But it'll be incumbent upon all Republicans, not just Donald Trump. He speaks from a very large platform, the bully pulpit of the presidency. But every member of Congress is going to have to go back his district, their districts, and say, hey, this is the reason this is going to work, and spell out every detail of this bill. Because we've seen in the polling data, generally speaking, you can say either it's a good thing or a bad thing and be right most of the time. And so it's just dependent upon, who's got the biggest megaphone to make this case. And yet this is going to be a mad scramble. I mean, we're just starting an election process for 2026, and it's still a long way away.
Well, it's even a longer way away, though, for some of these measures in the legislation to actually take effect, Jeannie, when we think about some of the changes to Medicaid, for example. Do people not have to feel it first before it affects political outcomes in the way that they vote?
Yeah, Kayleigh, I'm so glad you raised that, because this is one of the biggest challenges for Democrats, is the fact the way that Republicans wrote the legislation, they put off the cuts to Medicaid, to the food programs, to SNAP until after the election, and they front-loaded some very popular aspects of the bill. And so Democrats are going to be in a difficult position of going out there and saying they've cut your Medicaid, they've cut your food, they've cut your all these things, and yet people won't feel it. So it's going to be a hard message for Democrats to send. I think they're going to have to send a message of betrayal, that this is a very regressive bill. Donald Trump lied to you. The Republicans lied to you. They said they had your back and they were working for you, but they're really working for the people in Mar-a-Lago, at Palm Beach. The people who are winning are at the top. The people at the bottom are losing. But Democrats are going to have to do something they haven't done in the past, which is sell that and bring back the working class. And Donald Trump has proved to be a formidable obstacle to doing that so far.
Well, now that he's signed this into law, Rick, is the next act trade? We've got a lot of letters flying around today. And in fact, we just saw the EO formalizing the extension of the tariff deadline to 12:01 a.m. August 1st. So we've apparently kicked this officially down the road to next month here. I think 14 letters was the count. A lot of new tariffs being floated, but they don't take effect until next month. Is this an emboldened president or a taco?
It's hard to tell. I mean, everything is high noon at the White House.
Yeah,
I just can't figure the scheduling out. And we'll see. I mean, look, at some point, the rubber's going to hit the road and there'll be tariffs. And we don't know when that precisely is going to happen, because consistently these dates have changed. But it is sort of interesting counter-programming, because when you look at the data, people are very nervous about these tariffs. They think they'll cause inflation. That part has actually permeated the American culture, right? Mm-hmm. This is going to cause us to pay more or not even have access to goods that were normally imported that we like. And so there's a lot of hesitation, a lot of consumer concern about these kinds of policies related to the tariffs. And on the other hand, generally speaking, people like the idea of tax cuts, especially if you're new to them, like Social Security and no tax on tips. So you've got this strange pendulum moving back and forth on the economic sector. And the only thing that could happen next is inflation. And that would actually tie the two things together in a way that the administration wouldn't want to have happen.
Well, what the administration wants to have happen here, Jeannie, at least the president himself, as he suggested many times, is he wants to make deals. He wants to have deals to announce. And it's not just in the trade arena. You can apply this to geopolitics as well. And deals have been kind of hard to come by since he took office again 6 months ago. At what point does the level of frustration for President Trump boil over that he hasn't been able to accomplish that yet?
Yeah, I mean, we are still waiting for that. The American public, the voters, traditionally give leaders some time. But with the passage of this bill and with his policy on tariffs and with everything going on in foreign policy, he owns Washington, the GOP does. They own the economy, and he's going to have to live with the consequences of having made enormous number of promises. If he doesn't deliver, he's going to have a hard time blaming Joe Biden for that. And of course, in the context of these tariffs, it's ironic that we are talking again about a very regressive economic policy, because these are taxes that will be borne by the lower and middle classes in this country, not by people overseas. And Democrats have to start making this point. Most economists say that if he goes forward with these, we will start to feel the effects in the summer into the fall, just as the school year comes around. So another example of very regressive policies on the part of this administration that he's going to have to explain to the American public, and Democrats better start talking about.
A lot to talk about with Rick and Jeannie after 4 days. Jeannie Shanzano, Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you, as always. Coming up, President Trump set to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this evening in Washington. We'll bring you the details and what we're watching for with Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, former State Department official, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
they're having a private dinner. There's many important matters that are obviously ongoing in the region, as you know. The utmost priority for the president right now in the Middle East is to end the war in Gaza and to return all of the hostages. Also, as you know, there was a ceasefire proposal that Israel supports that was sent to Hamas, and we hope that they will agree to this proposal.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today providing insight into what's on the agenda for the private dinner between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that is set to begin shortly at the White House. Joining us now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio, Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and former deputy envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Mara. As we consider what the president wants to see here, he wants a ceasefire agreement in Gaza at the least. An end to the war, obviously, is the ultimate aim. What real chance does he have at furthering that objective through this dinner this evening?
Thanks, and good to be back with you guys. I think he's got a decent chance of getting to a temporary ceasefire. In other words, the kind of 60-day reprieve that has been the case twice previously now. I think the challenge with that is Hamas is increasingly reticent to go through a 60-day ceasefire when the conflict begins again, and when there continues to be, on the Israeli side, no day after, planning for what happens in Gaza, what happens to the Palestinians, if in fact Hamas is wiped out completely, how and who governs Gaza. And in addition to that, Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure from the Israeli population. The idea of there being reportedly 20 hostages still alive and that you only get half of them out this time through a 60-day measure. So that's a problem. So it is doable, but the real question is what kind of discussions can they have about a permanent end to this conflict, which is not something that Netanyahu has to date been supportive of.
This is Benjamin Netanyahu's third visit to the White House. No other world leader has been more than once. What do we know about their relationship? What's going to happen behind closed doors at this dinner?
Well, we know that what Netanyahu values is being able to say, Joe, exactly what you just said, that he, unlike any other world leader, has been at the White House more often than anyone else. That said, he and Trump reportedly are not great friends. They may be a little bit too alike one another for that to be the case, too many similarities. And so I think that there has been some tension in the relationship. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu's last visit in April was not a positive for him. They reportedly discussed Israeli plans to strike in Iran. And as you recall, Trump very publicly discounted that or put down his plan for negotiations with Iran. And we should say that in addition to discussing the Gaza ceasefire and probably taking some sort of victory lap on Iran and their public recounting of this meeting, they also have to discuss another area where there's likely differences, which is whether or not, as President Trump suggests, negotiations should be pushed forward for Iran on nuclear terms, and that has not been something that Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks is a good idea, and he's been clear on that.
Well, we spoke about Iran and the optics of Iran contrasting with the optics around Gaza earlier today, Mara, with Natasha Hall, who's with CSIS. She joined us on the early edition of Balance of Power. This is what she told us, and we'll have you respond.
President Trump doesn't like bad optics. Gaza was bad optics. I think, U.S. stealth bombers bombing Iranian nuclear sites made him look like a strong president, made him look like he was making things happen. And now we're sort of back to square one with Gaza. And so, I think that whatever we see in the days and weeks ahead, I think for both Netanyahu and for Trump, focusing on Iran is better for them politically.
So when we consider that focus on Iran, Mara, to your point about Israel perhaps not being comfortable with the idea of some kind of diplomatic accord being reached between the U.S. and Iran, is it possible that Netanyahu is going to push Trump instead to allow Israel to finish the job if it proves too much nuclear capability has still been left in Tehran's hands?
So I think it's less likely that there is a question of finishing the job as much as I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu's view would be you continue to go back to Iran when and as you see any signs of increases in their nuclear capability. So it might be every few months, it might be sooner than that. But what it basically acknowledges is what President Trump has thus far not been willing to acknowledge, which is that Iran continues to have most likely some of the enriched material from the sites that from some of the sites have been attacked, not all of them, but Iran likely has some enriched material and has the ability to continue with its nuclear program. I've got to say, though, President Trump has not explicitly acknowledged that, the idea that he wants to go forward with negotiations with Iran certainly implies that.
What are the chances that Iran is struck once again by Israel, Mara?
So I think, again, that in Netanyahu's vision, that's part of an ongoing strategy. Others would dispute that that is, in fact, a strategy as opposed to a series of tactics. And that is not something I think that President Trump is eager to return to, which is why I think he wants to push forward on a negotiating path with Iran. And it's hard to estimate whether Netanyahu will do what he did back in April, which is to hear Trump out and then go ahead and do it anyway, bargaining that President Trump will, if Israel looks like they're being successful, will go with them. And another factor in this is how Iran responds to whatever kinds of overtures Steve Witkoff and others on Trump's team are putting forth to encourage them to go forward in negotiations. And they could also go forward in negotiations and still, in a covert manner, be continuing to work on their nuclear activities, which is probably what Netanyahu is most concerned about.
Mara, we just have 30 seconds left here, but when we consider who comes into the meeting this evening with a stronger hand, how much depends on what leverage President Trump is willing to hold over Netanyahu's head?
The United States always has the strongest hand, or has to date. Can't speak on where we're going to be given the kind of budget situation that President Trump has put us in now with the reconciliation bill. But generally, you should always assume the United States has the strongest hand, whether it's Israel or anyone else. But every country also has their own independent views, is going to go forward with them as they please.
Mara, it's great to have you back. Mara Rudman, professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. We thank you as always. And thank you for joining us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.